what we'd really like to do, so I've stepped you through yield measures, I've stepped you through some partial productivity measures. What we'd really like to get a handle is on multi-factor productivity measures. And some of you are probably aware of the work that Keith Fugle's done recently to try and come up with some global measures of multi-factor productivity growth and try and address this issue about whether on that metric there's been a slowdown in multi-productivity growth. And Keith writes that he sees no evidence of a general slowdown in sector-wide, he's calling it TFP growth, at least through to 2006. And in fact, if anything, the growth rate in agricultural TFP accelerated in recent decades. But the caveat there is that despite this general optimistic conclusion, growth being pretty uneven, and in fact TFP growth may in fact be slowing in the rich countries in the world vis-a-vis the developing countries in the world. We played around with sort of trying to think about what you might be able to say, given the sorts of data that Keith and others, including myself, have tried to use to get a measure of multi-factor productivity. And just conceptually, on one slide here, one of the ways to think about this is not only what you're measuring, but be explicit about what you're not measuring. And so a TFP, by definition, would be measuring a vector of all the total relevant output that you want to measure vis-a-vis the totality of the relevant inputs, so the Q over the X. But in fact, what we presented with in the available data is a measure of some of the relevant outputs and some of the relevant inputs. So we call those the included outputs and included inputs. So we can express Q sub E and X sub E as a measure of the share of the excluded outputs vis-a-vis the totality of the outputs, which we can't often measure. And ditto with respect to XE, the excluded inputs vis-a-vis the total share of total inputs. So TFP is actually a measure of included and excluded inputs relative, included and excluded outputs relative to included and excluded inputs. And if you take the total differential of that and look at the differential rates of growth of a conceptual ideal called TFP and a practical reality, we're calling MFP here, you get the sort of obvious result that it depends on how quickly the excluded outputs are growing vis-a-vis the included outputs, and how quickly the excluded inputs are growing vis-a-vis the included inputs. And it matters whether you're omitting a lot of relevant outputs or a lot of relevant inputs will drive smaller or larger changes in our measured MFP vis-a-vis our ideal TFP. So I'm very careful to talk about MFP because I think that's practically all we're measuring when Keith and others talk about TFP. And there's a bunch of us, myself included, that have actually tried to get a global handle on productivity growth rates. And surprisingly, given the importance of the issue, comparatively thin literature actually when you go looking around, we all use different years and different data span different countries, and we use a range of different methodological approaches, but we have one thing in common. We all draw on the same database. We all draw on the World Bank and the FO data. However much we torture that data, that's our limiting factor when we're going to do these analyses. And what is that? If you scan across these studies, what is the data this is pretty typical of the sorts of data that you've got there and that virtually all these studies use to get to global measures of productivity performance. So one, the land variables are an undifferentiated count of hectares or acres, and they're a count of basically arable land, permanently pastured land and permanently crop area, and there's variance of that from one state to the next, but essentially that's what it is. There's no attempt to account for innate differences in the quality of that land or to differentiate between irrigated and non-irrigated land. The labour count is again just a head count of labour in agriculture. No attempt to account for part-time farming, no attempt to account for the massive change in the quality of labour in agriculture around the world. The capital measure, we're often forced to use really crude counts of just tractors in use, or tractors on farms. Some studies take percent irrigated area as a proxy for capital service flows. Livestock is often thrown in these equations with not much care and thought to whether we're thinking about traction animals versus biological capital, which is breeding stock and so forth. And again, just some sort of count or weighted count of the head counts of buffaloes and cattle and pigs and sheep and goats. And materials, we're woefully lacking in data on that. We usually just take a crude measure of fertiliser use and omit things like energy, seeds, and pesticides and herbicides and things of that nature. So that's the data that we've got to torture to try and come up with some views about what's going on productivity growth. If you go and look at measured output and input growth rates, and I sort of benchmark this on Keith's study, not to beat up on Keith, but it's just a recent one, and I think Keith's done, my view, and Julie's view too, that Keith's done the best job you can do, but the question is whether it's good enough to come up with some meaningful perspectives on what's going on in productivity. So the left-hand column indicates the rates of growth of the food production index for the World Bank and FAO over this 1961 to 2006 period, and then the input measures that we've got, the land, labour, tractor, fertiliser and livestock measures. This is for the US, all right? So this is the data that's presented in the World Bank FAO files for the US. If we take our measure, our so-called InSTepp measure of these output and input measures, you can, and then compare one set of measures to the other. So the right-hand column is the ratio of the rates of growth of our measure vis-a-vis the World Bank measure. So if that value comes up to 1, then we've got identical rates of growth. And we can see that we've got pretty close in terms of our aggregate measures of output growth. But all of the action in terms of comparing the FAO World Bank data to our measures of input use lie with respect to more effective productivity lie with respect to the input data. So we're estimating labour is actually retracting, so there's a decline in labour use in US agriculture of 1.31% per annum, and the World Bank data is 1.29%, so that's comparatively close, notwithstanding that's a very crude measure. The land measure is less close, and the capital measure is less close, and the fertiliser/materials measures is less close. So you get this big gap in terms of the sort of measured rates of growth of these inputs. You have to come up, if you're going to do some growth accounting, with some weights to put on those to add those rates to change up. And so what's typically used is some input cost shares. And so the left-hand column is the cost shares for the US that Keith proposed or assumed on his data. The second column in is the cost shares we get out of our InSTepp series. And again, the ratio of the two would be close to 1 if the cost shares were identical. The further it is away from 1, the further our cost share estimates deviate from Keith's. So again, this is just all for the US. So if you pull that together and come up with a view of what the World Bank FAO data says has happened with respect to aggregate input use in US agriculture, you'd estimate that over this 20-plus year period it's been growing at about 0.54% per annum. We reckon it's been shrinking marginally. If you look at what that implies, we're about the same with respect to output, so if you look at what it implies with respect to relative rates of growth and more effective productivity, we get quite different views of the world. We're growing away at 1.73%. Keith measured it at 1.18%. And if you compound that up across all of the countries in the data set, you start to get, to me, some confounding problems about what you're actually measuring and how you can interpret it when you've got these big differentials and sort of the more ideal sets of input measures that you might like and notions about how important they are with respect to production shares. So my bottom lines are that we've probably tortured the available data to death, and we have to think of what are the mismeasured aspects of the data, and increasingly folks are putting in work here in Australia and work I know in South Africa and other countries in the world to really dig down and get sort of local data sets and try to get more accurate measures of output and input use in agriculture, which tries to adjust for changes in quality and things of that nature over time. But having done that, we still get this measured productivity growth, and so we haven't chipped away at the residual entirely, so something else is going on. And my views are we have to go back and think about the actual process that we're modelling, and it's a brute biological process, and a brute is heavily reliant on natural inputs, most of which we pay no attention to, and most of which we don't measure. But there are new measures coming to bear, and new ways of modelling, particularly in the bioeconomic framework, about the relationship between these natural inputs and output productivity. So I think a blending of these new data sets and new ways of using them might help us understand the potential drivers of productivity and the potentials for productivity going forward, more so than running yet another regression or slicing the available World Bank or FAO data in a different way. So I've talked about comparing our data with Keith's data and some of the sort of obvious measurement discrepancies there. I'll give you a couple of really quick overviews of some of the work we're doing in the Gates project. Because Gates are very interested in productivity driven development and the sources of that to try and target their investments to try and enhance those productivity growth rates in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere as well. So I'll give you a little indication about why I think getting a better handle on these natural inputs might yield us some dividends, and I'll use an example of work done on changing pattern for fertility of soil in sub-Saharan Africa. Things that are entirely left out of almost all of the productivity literature, to the best of my reading, a whole set of exports. These are natural inputs that actually reduce output and lower productivity. I'll give you an example of crop diseases that are related to weather, but not entirely related to weather. So putting weather variables in a regression equation, whatever, isn't actually going to get a handle on this. And I'll end up with a confounding prospect of issues related to the change in location of production, as we can see. So we are modelling the world pixel by pixel by pixel in this Gates project, and what we've developed is a framework for taking soil data, and climate data, and terrain data, and other things that you think would drive crop production processes, and taking a whole suite of crop modelling tools like Aares and DSAT and ABS and so forth, which are typically fitted on point data, and trying to fit these data at a pixelated level. So we're taking, at a pixel, we've got views about what the soils and climate and so forth are, and then modelling out production, yield, productivity performances over long sweeps of time. But just as an example of one of these sort of left out variables, what we did here was we took our where in the world is maize map and laid it over sub-Saharan Africa. We said, let's assume that we converted the area currently in maize, currently being 2000, from grasslands in 1961 into maize production. And let's assume we continuously cropped that area in corn from then to now. And let's assume we did it like most farmers in sub-Saharan Africa do, that is with very low marginal inputs of fertiliser and other sorts of inputs. And what happens in terms of yield performance is going from 65 to 2000, you can see that you go from fairly broad-based yield performance of around 4 to 3,000 tonnes per hectare down to a half to 1 tonne per hectare. It turns out that the 1 to a half tonne per hectare is about the landscape in sub-Saharan Africa now. And so there was a lot of innate fertility in that soil that's just got swept out by a lack of soil management and a lack of replenishing soil nutrients and soil organic matter and things of that nature. So this is a very powerful indicator of we're holding everything else constant here and just allowing our soil quality to denude over time. And so it gives you an indication, a Gates indication, that if they regressed that soil quality and nutrients or organic matter, probably how we might rehabilitate yield performance, even following the sort of challenging production conditions